Following the recent release of Justice League, we now live in a world where DC and Marvel have their own individual live-action ensemble movies. But that begs the inevitable question, which one is superior, Marvel or DC? Well, sit back, because in this video we are going to find out, and most likely piss a bunch of you off in the process. Let the battle commence. The story for Justice League is that following Superman's death from Batman vs Superman, the evil ruler Steppenwolf has come to Earth in search of some superpowered apocalyptic cubes called Mother Boxes. Now for safekeeping, these Mother Boxes have been separated on Earth. One has been given to the Atlanteans, 1 to the Amazonians, 3 to the Elves, 7 to the Dwarves, and 9 were given to Great Kings of Men. Okay, probably not those last few, but you see what I'm getting at here. It's not a very original story. But unfortunately, it is the only story. There's a big bad guy who has come to conquer Earth, and our heroes have to stop him. So yeah, that's the plot of Justice League. I'm not gonna lie, that is pretty weak. Moving on, the story for the Avengers is that S.H.I.E.L.D. is performing experiments on an extraterrestrial power source called the Tesseract. However, out of nowhere, they are interrupted by Loki, who kills a few guards, brainwashes a couple of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s members, and leaves with the Tesseract. As a result of Loki's actions, Nick Fury decides that it's time to bring together a team of heroes that him and his faction have been monitoring over the years to stop Loki and to retrieve the Tesseract. And from here, our heroes meet for the first time, they argue, an unexpected plot twist takes place, they reconcile, and band together for a final battle. So as you can clearly tell, the story has considerably more going on than Justice League. But my main issue with the storytelling in Avengers is that the story itself, although a bit slow-paced, is pretty damn good. But the way in which it unfolds is criminally underwhelming. The big twist in the movie is that Loki intentionally gets captured and ultimately plans that the team will get in an argument, and in a rage of anger, Banner will turn into the Hulk and go on a rampage causing trouble for the group. Now that is a pretty good setup, but the execution is so simplistic that despite the fact that all this heavy-handed stuff is going on, it's not the least bit impactful. An example of this done right was in The Dark Knight, when you find out that the Joker's ultimate goal was to manipulate an emotionally distraught Harvey Dent. Not only was it strong on the page, but when it happens, it hits you with a sense of shock and urgency. When you find out Loki's plan, it just sort of happens, and it doesn't give you a satisfying punch of realization. And it's this poor execution which ultimately turns this plot twist, which on paper is great, to a standard and unsatisfying story element. So with regards to the story of both movies, I think they are both weak, but the movie that just edges it, but barely, is The Avengers. The story is simple and efficient, but as I said, if the execution was more shocking and satisfying, then The Avengers would have absolutely crushed this round, but unfortunately, it didn't. Now with regards to how both movies introduced the characters, in Justice League, the introduction to Batman and Wonder Woman was absolutely perfect. And that is largely down to the fact that these characters have had an ample amount of development in their previous films. But the introduction to Aquaman, Flash, and to a certain extent even Cyborg, was rushed and in dire need of additional time. Now in The Avengers, the heroes' recruitment was quick and rushed too, but they already had their previous movies to set them up, so it was actually in the film's benefit to rush their ensemble. In Justice League, however, seeing as we are being introduced to most of these characters for the first time, their introductions needed to be more realized and fleshed out. As is, each of them suffer in their own unique way. Some more than others. But this is primarily down to the 2-hour runtime mandate that Warner Brothers idiotically forced upon the movie. Yeah, Warner Brothers actually stuck their nose where it didn't belong again and actually crippled this movie. First, they decided to skip the much-needed solo films to set up each of these heroes, they proceeded to rush out their ensemble movie, and then, despite forcefully including 3 new superheroes that had no development time, they had the nerve to say to their director, make a giant epic movie around all of them, and it has to be under 2 hours long. Oh, and don't forget to flesh out all of the characters and put this back on track to be a successful franchise for us. So yep, this movie is another classic example of the studio interfering and meddling with a project and then expecting the director to make a fantastic movie out of their ridiculous demands. Recruiting the Justice League should have been so fun and inspired. Instead, it was underdeveloped and sporadic, and as a result, it was just okay. Now it's time to talk about Marvel's character ensemble. Now when the Avengers were being recruited, I also found it to be quite underwhelming. I remember when I was watching this in the cinema back in the day, and it really annoyed me that Black Widow was recruiting. Now no, before any of you say it, it's not for any sexist reason or anything. On the contrary, the reason I found this to be a problem is because we didn't know Black Widow at the time. Prior to this, the only other appearance she had was in Iron Man 2, and she wasn't very well received in the movie at the time. So watching her and Nick Fury recruit the heroes instead of someone like Stark was really disappointing. I mean, just look at how much fun it was watching him recruit Peter Parker in Civil War. Could you imagine what his first encounter would have been like with Rogers and Banner under different circumstances, rather than having them all meet in a facility? The only character that got a great introduction was Thor, as he brought a pretty badass action scene with him. So with regards to watching the heroes come together, even though it didn't have the ideal foundation, it was actually slightly better executed in Justice League. Because watching Batman and Wonder Woman bring the team together is far more interesting than watching Black Widow and Nick Fury. And Superman's introduction to the team was also a really nice touch. So the movie with a superior story is The Avengers, but the movie with the more satisfying execution of bringing together our heroes is Justice League. Now in Justice League, we have some new heroes introduced to the team. The first one is Aquaman. Now the movie definitely elevated his visual status to a whole new level, and it also gave him a new personality. This is like no other version of Aquaman I have ever seen in either the comic books or his animated portrayals. And I have absolutely no problem with that, because incidentally, this is actually my favorite version of the character. He is strong and resilient, but he also has a lighthearted side to him too, and Jason Momoa portrays all those characteristics flawlessly. Next up, we have Barry Allen, and his first scene in the prison with the thug was fine, but as soon as he visits his father, from that point, he completely loses any potential credibility. You just don't feel sorry for him, and you don't get a feel of the tragic, emotional, and helpless nature of his situation. In the TV show you do, but not here. Also, he was constantly trying to act socially awkward, but every single time, he failed to authentically pull off the characteristic. Instead, he seemed more like he had a mental deficiency. But yeah, Ezra Miller's portrayal of the Flash was disappointing. Whenever he talks 95% of the time, he is a problem, but when he's in the costume and you see his facial expressions, then he suddenly becomes tolerable. How people said he was the highlight of the movie, I will never know. Next up is a character that I was most concerned about, and honestly, I thought was going to suck going by the trailers. Cyborg. Now surprisingly, I really liked and admired how they handled his introduction and the way in which he looked at his condition as a disease. The movie is showing us the early stages of his transformation, so even though brooding is not his usual form of expressing emotions, it did make sense here and made you sympathize with him. And thankfully, those unbelievably stiff line deliveries that he had in the trailer have been reshot and are now much more relaxed and laid back. So yeah, Cyborg really surprised me, and what's interesting is that I have never liked the idea of Cyborg in the Justice League in either the animated features or the comics. The reason is because Cyborg is a worthy member of the Teen Titans, and that's where he belongs. The only reason he was brought into the Justice League was because the team was looking rather white, so DC forced him in to add a bit of color to the group, even though they already had a perfect black character in the group anyway. So I never approved of Cyborg as a member of the Justice League. However, this movie marks the first time I actually welcomed him to the league, and that genuinely surprised me as the comics and animated versions, which are highly praised, were never able to accomplish this for me, but the movie did. And returning heroes such as Batman and Wonder Woman were just as good as they were in their previous movies. Superman, on the other hand, has been completely transformed. And I am not just referring to his CG'd out mustache. Literally every complaint we have had with Zack Snyder's interpretation of Superman has been rectified, and he feels very much in line with both the animated version from the show and Christopher Reeve's interpretation. This to me is the most perfect representation of Superman I have ever seen, and I cannot wait to see more of him in Man of Steel 2 if this is how he is going to be portraying the character. Batman though has been really toned down with regards to his dark and brooding persona. Thankfully, his tone and feel is completely intact, but it's just his depressed mental state which has been significantly reduced, and there wasn't much of a transition to accommodate that. Also, the camaraderie between him and Wonder Woman is fantastic. In their very first scene, they immediately have this mutual respect for one another following their team up in Batman vs Superman, and even though the dialogue between the rest of the heroes isn't nearly as strong or plentiful, the communication between them was still great. Speaking of communication, the only place where it was practically non-existent is with Batman and Superman. These two are regarded as one of the best duos in all of comic books, and this movie really needed to advance that teamwork camaraderie, and unfortunately, it doesn't. But again, we could have easily gotten more screen time of the two in this movie, but that 2-hour time limit prevented it from happening. As for the heroes in the Avengers, Black Widow has an awesome opening scene where it appears she is being interrogated when in actuality, she is just playing the victim so she can do her own verbal interrogation. She also manages to get information out of Loki, and although this is beneficial for her character, it is detrimental for Loki as it shows him up as a pretty incompetent bad guy. And that's just the beginning. He then gets had over and over and over again.
I am a god, you dull creature, and I will not be bullied by that.
That being said, I really like how Banner was actually recruited to track the gamma radiation from the Tesseract, as gamma is one of his areas of expertise. He was never recruited for the Hulk, which would have been the conventional route for the story to go. Captain America's recruit was as simple as could be, but I gotta say, upon rewatching the Avengers, I didn't really like Captain America at this stage. I don't hate him, but he acts like he has a gigantic sized stick up his butt for 85% of the movie. I far preferred the way they developed him in Winter Soldier and Civil War, but I guess everyone needs to start off somewhere. However, it was pointed out to me that Captain America's costume in this movie looked like something from a kid's store, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. And Stark is being recruited despite the fact that Nick Fury told him he didn't qualify.
Yeah, apparently I'm volatile, self-obsessed, don't play well with others.
Yeah, my point exactly. But you know what, I bet they will have a really good reason for recruiting him back.
This isn't about personality profiles anymore.
Oh, that was easy. They might as well have just said that he qualified from the start. Anyway, Robert Downey Jr. does a great job, as always, playing Stark, and Tony doesn't cause trouble at this point like he does in the later movies. And as for Thor, he just invites himself, and surprisingly, he doesn't show up until 45 minutes into the movie. And Hulk doesn't even show up until an hour and 15 minutes in. But yeah, Thor is just as good as he was before, and Mark Ruffalo as Bruce Banner I initially didn't like because I wanted to see Edward Norton reprise his role, but you do get used to Ruffalo's portrayal. Now essentially in this movie you are watching the characters attempt to put up with each other as they don't fully trust or know one another at this point. And that is a similar case for Justice League, but it purposefully doesn't spend too much time on that part of their dynamic. Now just to make it clear, the portrayal and interactions of both heroes in their respected crossover movies is fantastic. But whichever one you're more partial to really comes down to which roster of heroes you prefer. And for me, Batman is my favourite superhero followed by Superman. And that makes Justice League have the superior heroes in my opinion. Either way, both films do a fantastic job at representing most of their respected superheroes, and as a result, they both win. Now the action in both of these movies is solely dependent on each of the heroes' unique superpowers and fighting techniques. In the Avengers, the action is slick, well choreographed, and does a lot to showcase the heroes' superpowers with great use of cinematography and camera angles. Iron Man in particular has a fair bit more variety than the rest of the heroes during combat. But that being said, I far prefer the action whenever Hulk is on screen because he pretty much annihilates everything in his path. Although, how Black Widow is able to easily fight off these alien monsters with a pistol and her fists is beyond me, and even when she utilizes alternate methods, they are so convenient. And even though the final action scene is good, it was clearly inspired by the climax fight in Transformers 3 way too much. The big Transformer-like spaceships, and even some of the choreography at times reminded me so much of Transformers, such as this pan shot of Shia LaBeouf running, and a very similar one performed by Captain America. Also, I didn't like how the enemy threat was ultimately eliminated in the same old cheap style as the Phantom Menace. So overall, the action in the Avengers is good, but there was never a time where I thought it was great. Now with regards to the action in Justice League, the way in which the heroes all enter their first fight in their own signature entrance was awesome, and watching them help each other with their own unique abilities and skill sets was really creative and beautifully conveyed. Just the sheer amount of physical prowess they exhibit during combat is absolutely wonderful, and the utter extent of their abilities is so enjoyable to watch. And then when you see in stark contrast that Batman is just a guy in a costume and doesn't have superpowers like the rest of his teammates, means he has a significantly higher risk of death, and due to his lack of powers he has to take inventory, and he does this very efficiently. And this made me notice the problem with the heroes' fighting style in the Avengers. Their choice of weapons strike me as very dull. When you get down to it, they all have very similar close range and long range attacks. When Iron Man wants to attack someone, he hits them with his armor-plated fist. When Thor wants to attack someone, he hits them with his armor-plated hammer. When Captain America wants to attack someone, he hits them with his armor-plated shield. As for their long-range attacks, Iron Man fires a laser beam out of his armor-plated hand, Thor fires a lightning beam out of his armor-plated hammer, and Captain America just throws his armor-plated shield. You see the similarities here. Most of the heroes just have very simple close and long-range attacks, and although watching them fight is fun, the possibilities are limited. That being said, with Justice League there are some really strange things that happen from time to time. The most memorable incident was when Cyborg gets attacked with Steppenwolf's axe, which cuts halfway through his arm. And right after that, he also gets his leg pulled off, and yet somehow, he doesn't react to what should obviously be an excruciatingly painful experience. So although the action in both movies is good in their own right, in Justice League it's more creative, fast-paced, and incredibly inventive in the way it gets the heroes to collaborate and assist each other. Also, the Justice League have far more powers at their disposal, which makes the action more versatile and open to multiple methods of attack. So because of this, the movie with the superior action is Justice League. Before we talk about the main villains, let's first talk about the army of minions that the heroes go up against. In both movies, they are made entirely out of CGI, and in the Avengers, they are just a bunch of ancient Egyptian-looking monsters. And they get taken out pretty easily. I mean, even Black Widow takes them out like nothing. Now in Justice League, our heroes are fighting hordes of parademons, and the parademons were actually given an upgrade in this movie. I always thought that they were disposable minions in the comics and animated features, but in here, they were definitely harder to take out, especially whenever Batman was involved in a confrontation with them. And now it's time to talk about the main villain of the movie. And I know practically all of you and your grandmothers have essentially expressed your opinion on Steppenwolf by now, and that doesn't change anything in the slightest. I am still going to submit you to my opinion. So sit back, listen up, and act like you're interested. Now when Steppenwolf first shows up and fights the Amazons, he was actually pretty good. I mean, he talked too much and wouldn't shut up, but the movie showcased his strength very effectively, and he absolutely annihilated everything in his path. But then when you find out that his introduction is practically the only development he gets, all of his problems immediately become apparent. To put it simply, he just comes off as another incarnation of the Suicide Squad and Wonder Woman villains. He's certainly much better than the villain from Suicide Squad, but he is only marginally better than the one from Wonder Woman. I think one of the primary problems is that his history felt very shallow and generic. He's just another ruler who makes it his lifelong objective to acquire some 3D shapes of power. If he was given an additional purpose to obtain them, then he would have been more interesting. I mean, imagine if his whole purpose was to acquire them because he was afraid of someone even more powerful chasing after him. That someone being Darkseid. And if Steppenwolf failed to match or exceed his power, then Darkseid would have killed him. At the very least, that would have been something. It would have provided him with much more depth, and as well as hinting at future movies, Steppenwolf wouldn't have fallen under the same category as every other mad world conqueror. But as is, he is just a lame villain. The very definition of typical and generic. Definitely not the worst of the comic book movie villains, but he is up there. Now it's time to talk about Loki. Now I have never properly talked about Loki. However, a lot of you are actually under the impression that I don't like him. Well, now's my time to elaborate. First off, I think Tom Hiddleston is a great actor. From leaving next to no impression at all in the first Thor movie to then elevating himself and becoming many people's favourite Marvel character is very impressive and something to be admired. So I have nothing but praise for him with regards to that. But whenever people address him as a great villain, that's where my praise wears thin. I've already showed you the scenes where he gets had an absurdly laughable amount of times, but then the film takes it to even more ridiculous lengths. After Hulk knocks him around a bunch of times, Loki already is reduced to looking pretty pathetic. But then, this happens. And that was the moment where I thought, Loki is nothing. I mean, it's good to have humor, but this is your main bad guy. He needs to maintain a certain level of dignity, but this just reduced him to nothing. So although I really do enjoy Loki as a character, he just isn't a villain I can take seriously. He is treated throughout this universe as a joke, and although he is pretty funny and entertaining, in my book, he is a terrible villain.
I don't think
Having said that, it's obvious who the better villain of the two movies is. Loki is far superior to Steppenwolf. And after having just expressed my thoughts about him, it is a bloody embarrassment that DC weren't able to make a superior villain. Let's talk about Danny Elfman. For those of you that don't know, Danny Elfman was a well-known and respected composer in Hollywood that used to churn out such beautiful and iconic soundtracks such as the 1989 Batman, The Nightmare Before Christmas, Edward Scissorhands, and even Batman Returns, which is essentially a combination of his Edward Scissorhands and Batman soundtrack with maybe a touch of Nightmare Before Christmas. And it worked! And that was the great thing with Danny Elfman. However unorthodox his intentions, the end result would always be a wonderful soundtrack that would consist of such passionately composed and beautifully conducted music. Now believe it or not, but the soundtrack for Justice League is composed by Danny Elfman, and 10 to 15 years ago this would have been great news, but now, not only is it unexciting, but it's actually quite concerning, because Elfman is now a mere shell of what he used to be. If you take two movies he has provided the composition for, Justice League and the Avengers Age of Ultron, there are countless times where the music between these two totally different movies is indistinguishable. Even when he does decide to incorporate snippets of his original Batman theme or the John Williams Superman score, they sound so flat and lack the satisfying impact that they are known for. It is astonishing how the sheer lack of diversity and creativity with Elfman's soundtracks have become. If the soundtrack for Justice League was better, then it would have made these scenes feel much more grand and epic. But unfortunately, the music lacks any solid impact and is overall really conventional. And for Danny Elfman, this is crap. But he clearly seems happy with himself. In a recent interview, he talked about how happy he was with the soundtrack, and when you take into account his previous work, that is really sad. The fact that he finds this conventional music to be worthy of praise is like he has no sense of standards anymore. For a composer to be given a project like Justice League and to then churn out something like this is just disgraceful. The thing to take away from all this is that Danny Elfman is unbelievably talented, and I really want to see him return to the musical genius he used to be. The Avengers is also an example as to how conventional music decreases the quality of a movie. A lot of the music is just there, and very rarely does it add anything to the film. And that's the case with pretty much all of these Marvel Cinematic Universe films. The only one that had great music through and through was The Incredible Hulk. Now, having said all of that, both of these films do have moments where the soundtrack actually makes certain scenes better. With the Avengers, the music during the few seconds where Captain America and Thor were both grabbing their weapons was cool, as was the scene where Hulk is being shot by an overwhelming amount of enemies, and the music during the scene where Tony takes the missile into the conventional enemy portal in the sky was also pretty darn cool. And Justice League had a couple good moments during its climax. But ultimately, both of these films are prime examples of how movies have lost their way when it comes to incorporating great, highly complementary and iconic music. So with regards to which soundtrack is superior, I think they're both equally underwhelming and neither of them deserve a point. So when you get down to it, the success of both of these ensemble movies is not only reliant on their own competence, but also the foundations of which they are built upon. The Avengers had individual movies to set up their heroes, and as a result, there was a feeling of accomplishment to see these characters all on screen together. Justice League did not have individual movies to set up its heroes, and as a result, it doesn't feel like a big event like the Avengers did. Also, as much as I've praised Justice League in this video, that doesn't mean I disregard the fact that it could have been better. And even though the Avengers has its own fair share of problems, it is riddled with much less when compared to Justice League. But at the same time, Justice League really does excel in other departments, and that elevates it right back up on similar levels with Avengers. It's time for the scores. As soon as I finished watching both of these movies, these scores immediately came to my head. Justice League gets a strong 7 out of 10, and The Avengers gets a standard 7. With that said, even though I personally prefer Justice League, the movie that is ultimately superior is The Avengers. I didn't like everything the movie did, but it made the most out of its subject matter, which was to assemble its heroes. Additionally, its intentions were in the right place, and it had built a steady foundation. In stark contrast, DC, or Warner Brothers' intentions, were in the wrong place, and the foundation was all resting on one movie. And the reason this movie is not doing too well in theaters is more down to the terrible, idiotic, and hasty business practices from Warner Brothers, as they have done nothing except demonstrate the utmost incompetence at setting up their extended universe. And the fact that their actor playing Batman wants to leave the role 2 movies in is just one of the many examples which showcases Warner Brothers' stupidity and inability to logically construct this universe. What else can you say except, you've got your universe now, how did you think it was going to turn out? We all predicted this wasn't going to work from the start. But in retrospect, after having compared both of these films, The Avengers Infinity War is most likely going to kick both of their butts judging by the trailer and the track record of the directors who are helming it. But only time will tell, and I am looking forward to finding out. Anyway, that's it for another Versus video. If you guys liked it, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, feel free to subscribe to my channel. It's free for you and good for me. Don't forget that you can also follow me on social media. I've included links to all of them in the video description. Thanks again as always for watching, guys, and I will catch all of you next time. Take care.